Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast, actionable insight backed by reliable data. I'm Lynn Dornblaser, client advisor for Mintel Solutions, and today I'm your host. This podcast marks the start of a series about tariffs, specifically related to consumer sentiment, attitudes, and behaviors, and also a discussion of what brands can do in response. So kicking off this series is a really broad discussion today about consumer sentiment and tariffs and how that sentiment looks very different from one part of the world to another. So today I've got two great guests. I'm joined by my esteemed fellow podcast host, Andrew Davidson, who's our Chief Insights Officer for Comperemedia. He's based in the U.S. And also Rich Shepard, who's Director of UK Reports Financial Services, and he's based in the UK. So I think first, we just need to level set here just a little bit to be clear to everyone listening in, and also for the purposes of this discussion. This is not an in-depth discussion of fiscal or governmental policy. It is also not a discussion about all the controversy regarding the use of tariffs. It's about the consumer and about what brands can do. And as we know, things change every single day. And that's something that we've been seeing just in the last couple days. So I think to start off, here's the question that I've got for the two of you. We talk about the impact of tariffs as a big, broad blanket statement, but the impact of tariffs and consumer sentiment about their impact is very different from one part of the world to another. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about what we see going on in the US, what we see going on in Europe, how Europe is not a homogeneous place, that it's different from one part of Europe to another. So let's start, Andrew, talking a little bit about what we see going on in the U.S. market.
Excellent. Well, Lynn, it's great to be with you on the pod and nice to be on the other side of the mic for a change. Yeah. I'm excited to be on the other side of the mic as a guest. And hey, Rich, hi, everybody. So let's set the stage a bit because I think we've moved into perhaps a new phase here. Perhaps you might call it the de-escalation phase of the tariffs, might call it the negotiation phase of the tariffs. Obviously, we've now seen, the UK has a deal. We've now heard that the US and China have established a 90-day pause. Stock markets are rising. Other countries could follow. So we've certainly moved into a new phase of this. From the consumer perspective, though, the economy remains fairly strong. Consumers are still spending. And listening to some of the recent earnings calls, resiliency was one of the words that sort of popped up quite a bit. And of course, recently the Federal Reserve decided to keep interest rates at current levels, which sort of echoed those indicators. I mean, that said, GDP was down in Q1, which of course is a key measure for the economy. But that was primarily due to a surge in imports related to the tariffs. It wasn't actually related to a cutback in consumer spending. So one of the things that's most striking about this is that consumers generally remain optimistic about their personal financial situation when we ask them about it in April. But that contrasts with a drop in consumer confidence that we've seen from, the key measures of confidence from the Conference Board, from the University of Michigan, both of them reporting serious declines in consumer confidence. And so you have this contrast that really reflects, I think, how differently people feel about their own personal situations versus what they perceive when they look at the economy overall, when they read the news. I will say, though, that, one of the things, of course, that, we're obviously following closely is just the levels of uncertainty. And there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now. And I've been referring to uncertainty as the word of the year, which is probably the understatement of the year. But, the economic uncertainty index, the economic policy uncertainty index, which tracks uncertainty, has surpassed pandemic era highs. It's a very uncertain time. Of course, that rattles companies, that rattles the markets, which in turn rattles consumers. So, most economists, of course, view tariffs as inflationary. We see in our data, 91% of consumers say they're concerned about rising prices. But I guess in summary, really, at the moment, consumers are concerned. They're worried. The warning lights are flashing But so far, the sort of the key indicators, that we track, inflation, unemployment, those all things seem to be holding up.
Mm-hmm. How is it across the pond, Rich? A little bit different.
Hi, Lynn. Yeah, so very different. Just the way that it's been framed, the way it's been experienced by consumers on this side of the pond is a lot different. And that's baked into the way that these tariffs have been set up, right? So it's been one-way traffic for the most part so far. And so when people are thinking about tariffs here, it's a few steps down the line, because until the UK, until the EU, if those bodies actually introduce retaliatory measures, there's no direct link between the tariffs and what consumers will face in prices in the immediate term, at least. So in the main, it's been more a case of thinking about what it means for consumers if they think about those steps down the lines. And that's where people start to think about jobs. It's where people start to think about the overall performance of the economy. As Andrew said, the economic indicators aren't really showing any repercussions from tariffs as yet. And I think we'd expect that. It is still very new, and I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. But looking ahead, I think something that's also important to keep in mind is that, yes, we're in this, or seemingly in this de-escalatory period, this de-escalatory phase. But it is important to keep in mind that even if things go back to a 10% baseline tariff, it's still a huge change in global trade. It's still a huge change in the way that businesses are going to interact with different markets, and it's a huge change in the way that consumers are going to interact with those products. When we look at our consumer data around financial well-being and confidence in Europe, particularly in the UK and Germany, we haven't seen any immediate impact in April from all this. And in fact, there is a slight irony that in the UK, at least, April gave us a really strong set of data for financial well-being. It was the strongest result actually that we'd seen in over a year. That may change going forward. It really depends on what the tariffs do. But at the moment, European consumers are really looking at what they were already looking at, what the circumstances they were already dealing with, which over here in the UK and in Germany to an even greater extent is basically stagflation. So they were already dealing with a pretty tricky set of economic circumstances. And so they're still trying to get into a recovery mindset. Tariffs is a new challenge, but it's certainly not the only one that they're facing.
You're right. That feels so different. It feels like the U.S. market is so focused on right now in this very moment, what are tariffs going to do? Whereas in Europe, it's much more about, tariffs are there. We're not going to worry about it now. We've got other things on our mind that we need to be focused on.
Yeah.
Does that feel...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's also an element of this isn't our issue for Europeans, right? This is something that's been imposed by, President Trump, essentially. And I think that the way that the tariffs have been framed in the media in particular is that these are President Trump's tariffs. We ran research in December in the UK and Germany where we asked people what they expected from the return of President Trump. And, everyone knows he's a very polarizing figure. You ask different people about President Trump, you'll get very, very different responses. And that's something that we see in Europe too. But there is an element of kind of, this is what people expected to a degree. People expected him to come and shake things up in one way or another. And there was a strong sense in the UK and Germany that would have real world repercussions for economies. So around a third of Brits, around half of Germans who were more negative, felt that the return of President Trump would have a negative impact on the British and German economies, respectively. So there is an understanding that there is a relationship between, what happens in one place and how that can play out in your local region. But yeah, for now, the tariffs aren't being seen having a real world impact on prices. So people are thinking more long term around what they can control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the other key difference really here with we think about US versus Europe and other countries. Of course, in the US we still have a lot of consumers are living paycheck to paycheck. So concerns about prices are very, very real for people. We've obviously had this sort of prolonged period of inflation, and many consumers still have their stretched with their household budgets, and so that concern, those concerns about prices going up are very real. And I think, at the same time, I think another kind of difference is how much, in the US, how much we're invested in the stock market. Yes, while the sort of monetary value of the stock market might be dominated by, higher income consumers, many sort of just regular people have their retirement funds, tied up in 401ks. They have college savings in 529 accounts. And so with the volatility in the stock market, that also impacts a broad, swath of the population. And so I think those two things, of course, make it very real, very imminent for people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it feels like for many consumers in the US, it feels perhaps not as bad, but it feels a little bit like 2008, 2009, thinking of the stock market, thinking of your investment portfolios, thinking of your 401ks, all of that. The reduction in value, it felt like almost overnight for so many consumers, really does create a lot of concern and a lot of gnashing of teeth, if nothing else.
Right. Well, there's that whole kind of idea of a negative wealth effect. If your investments are going down, maybe your behavior starts to change, even though you haven't actually realized anything in a material fashion. Maybe you'll start to change your behavior just of sort of anticipation of feeling like less wealthy.
Yes, exactly. Which really leads on very well to something else that's important for us to talk about, and that is, what are some of those ways that it feels like consumers are changing their behaviors now in possible anticipation of there being a real impact? I'm thinking especially what we're seeing in the U.S. market.
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting seeing how, for our US consumers, but companies first off just are good signals of kind of what's going on, and just sort of hearing recently how we've seen some of these companies, decide not to give guidance for the second half of the year, sort of a signal of like, how uncertain things are. When companies like Delta, or Ford, these are companies that are sort of, flagships and indicators for their respective categories. But that, obviously for consumers, I think one of the things we've been seeing is, front loading, this idea of, maybe with tariffs imminent, I'm going to go out and buy a car or electronics or some other item that is price sensitive in advance. And I think that's an interesting, dynamic, which, an unforeseen, consequence of this is like, with some banks coming out reporting that type of spending has risen in Q1, which was interesting. And then that, of course, that plays into marketing, right? You've got companies now talking about pre-tariff sales. We have a big, we're approaching the end of the month. We have Memorial Day in the US, which is it's a holiday, but also a typical time of retail sales. Of course, that, now in the context of the tariffs, that sort of takes on new meaning. I was seeing, the other day, I was seeing a company that sells mattresses in the US called Satva, lock in your prices before the tariffs. So there are these sort of opportunities. And of course, consumers sort of, playing into that. But, we've seen, spending shifts, 42% of consumers shopped around for better prices in the last couple of months, for better deals. That's behavior that we've seen over the last couple of years. But again, it takes on new meaning right now. And of course, companies like, discount retailers like Costco and Sam's Club and BJ's, these sort of types of companies where you can go in and stock up and get, more value, more bang for your buck, take on again, enhanced meaning right now. I think one sort of thing that we saw in our data, in our research, which was perhaps a bit more concerning, 1 in 3 consumers said that they had cut back on non-essentials in the last couple of months. And again, a type of behavior that we have seen as we've had this prolonged period of inflation. But that sort of, speaks to what we were sort of saying earlier. If we do start to see consumers start to cut back on their spending, and if that does start to endure, that has that ripple effect throughout the economy. But right now, I'm not seeing it in the data. But overall, big opportunities for brands to sort of really meet, shifting those, to address these consumer needs as they start to evolve during this period of time. But those are really, I think, what we're seeing on the short term.
Yeah, and in the UK and Germany, we're seeing very similar things. I think that it's important to, you rightly said, Andrew, that, we've had this period of high inflation and this period of uncertainty for a while now. And it is important to frame this as, for consumers, really the succession in now a long list of recent disruptions or crises, that you can take back to COVID, really. And for a lot of consumers, they've never broken out of that lockdown mindset, because they had the physical lockdowns. They then went straight into a period of real difficulty with their finances and almost into a financial lockdown. One upside of that is that households have developed resilience was mentioned earlier in the conversation, and that there has been a great deal of resilience that has been developed and acquired. And that's come in a few ways. I mean, we measure how people expect to behave in relation to prices on a very regular basis. And in the UK, we found recently that, a third of people are expecting to use low-cost retailers more. Around a third of people are expecting to buy more own-label products. Now, those behaviours are going to be really useful if we do get into an inflationary period, but they're also not abnormal anymore. They're kind of the modern shopper mindset in many ways. Yeah. So people are relatively prepared. And I think in the short term, those are the things that we're going to see on this side of the pond. I think longer term, one thing that will come out of the tariff conversation, and already has, is perhaps this turn towards localism. And we asked European consumers last month around various aspects of localism. And 4/5 of Brits, 3/4 of Germans told us that the impact of recent events had shown the importance of supporting local businesses. We've got around 2/3 of European consumers saying that supporting the local economy and supporting local producers is something that's a priority for them right now. So people are going to look for low prices to get them through another period of uncertainty. But I think they are also going to look for security. And, whatever ends up happening with the negotiations and the conversations that are ongoing, if we get to an end point in the tariff conversation, I think there will be a lasting impact psychologically of what it's all meant for consumers and where they can get their products from. Messaging around localism. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think the uncertainty, actually sort of the parallels to the pandemic, I think are kind of interesting, just because, when you look at that economic uncertainty index, it's really only the pandemic and now as to sort of where you have that sort of such high levels of uncertainty. And of course, going into the pandemic, the economy was strong. Going into the US economy was also arguably pretty strong. So there are some sort of interesting, parallels and certainly some lessons to be learned from that, for sure. But yeah, obviously that buy local plays across, both sides of the Atlantic, of course. You start to see companies in the US now sort of seeing that as an opportunity to promote Made in America, as well, wherever they can, and sort of build that into their marketing messaging.
Well, one thing that I wonder about when it comes to brands and the impact that we'll see, I know I'm seeing some clothing manufacturers, for example, talking about manufacturing in the U.S., that their clothes are made in the U.S. And that makes me wonder just a little bit of what the impact is going to be, regardless of whatever the tariff amounts are from China, what the impact is going to be on fast fashion. Since so much of fast fashion clothing is coming from China, and what that's going to do to prices and how consumers and how brands especially are going to respond. I'm wondering what else we see going on out there related to some specific categories.
Well, certainly the highest, from a consumer's perspective, the highest level of concern is around those sort of non-discretionary items, of course, that they're sort of typically purchasing on a daily or weekly basis. And that's where we'll likely see the price rises, of course, go up the most quickly. So things like produce and meat and dairy, items from the grocery store. That's perhaps where it's most visible. But of course, gas is also key. It's always a concern for consumers. It's probably the most visible indicator of inflation, given that it's, you see it as you drive around your local communities and it's sort of right there in your face. And then, of course, you've got larger ticket items like cars or electronics. And this is where, perhaps kind of perhaps where the front loading perhaps comes in. And we're already starting to see prices going up in certain areas. Right now, of course, we haven't yet sort of seen kind of confirmation that prices are going up based on the tariffs. Like Rich, you said, it's kind of early days, but there was an indicator that came out around used cars, tracked indicator around used cars in the US, which jumped last month to its highest level since October 2023. So, whatever's playing into that, whether it's sort of a surge in demand around front loading or, people rushing to buy cars, because they're concerned about tariffs, we are starting to see that sort of come through ripple effect, start to play out in the economy at large.
And while we, haven't seen anything so far in Europe around tariffs and how brands are necessarily responding to that, simply because, it's not that pressing an issue yet, we can look back, over the last few years and see where industries en masse really have had to change to appeal to a more price conscious consumer. And that makes me think about, things like leisure and the rise of stuff like competitive entertainment, competitive socializing, and really the way that when budgets are stretched, consumers still want to go out, they still want to have a good time, but they need to get more value, they need to get more bang for their buck. And that can come out in ways such as, multi-use venues where, yes, you can go and eat, but you're going to have entertainment and you're going to have all of these things at the same time, and combining these experiences. And I think that's a good signal for how services in particular can look to continue to find business and continue to attract consumers even when budgets are strained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know here in the U.S. we've seen consumers trading down in terms of their restaurant choices. So trading down from some of those nicer mid-scale restaurants to ones that are just a little bit less expensive. And you see that in some of the financial results from some of those restaurant chains on how some of them are doing. There's something else I wonder about too, and that is if we're going to see or continue to see, I suppose, what really came into the fore 2008, 2009, which is what people call that lipstick effect. I need to cut back. I need to watch what I'm spending, but I need a treat. So I'm not going on vacation, but I'm buying that fancy lipstick. I wonder if we'll see those affordable luxuries or those little small indulgences have an even greater place in the market.
Yeah, we've seen this month, we've already had people telling us that they are finding more comfort from food and drink such as chocolate. So people are looking at, those affordable luxury areas. And this is something that's again, as I say, it's never really gone away from the height of the cost of living crisis. And it's something that consumers typically do fall back on. I think that the particular context that we're living through and the sort of the hangover from recent years feeds into that as well. Because if people have been facing strained finances for quite some time now, for quite an extended period of time, there's only so much that people can put up with, right? There's only so many things that people can cut out of their budget, cut out of their lifestyle, and they need to go out and find that joy, find that little thing. It might just be that, in the case of the research that I just mentioned, it might just be that chocolate bar, but it also might be that holiday. And holidays are an interesting thing as well, because we've seen huge change in patterns and booking patterns and the types of holidays that people are taking. What comes through in our research is that people will protect holidays at all cost. It's the most non-discretionary of discretionary purchases. People may go away fewer times in a year, but they'll try and protect that main holiday if they can. Clearly only to a point, but it's something that we've certainly seen in the past and I would expect to see going forward as well.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things, it's almost like kind of regardless of what happens, it sort of induces a lot of stress for consumers, right? And there are opportunities for, to develop products and messaging to help consumers to alleviate some of these concerns, to navigate this stress of all of the volatility that they're seeing in the marketplace.
So for each of you, any final thought on what you think what's most important right now for brands to be doing?
I think a key message for brands whenever there's a rise in uncertainty is to, not get lost in the middle. You can't find yourself in a position where you're neither offering the cheapest option to consumers who are spending more time and more focus on their budgets, and at the same time not offering enough extra to be seen as a worthwhile, more expensive purchase and a more expensive splurge. So you've got to think about value in the round. So yes, price is going to be really, really important. But those other value claims, durability, we know has been a big winner in recent years. If you can prove that, yes, you're a little bit higher on the price point, but the product's going to last you longer or it's going to do more for you, then that's a way that people can win out. And I think it's easy for something like this to be almost pushed really into the long grass during times of real difficulty. But sustainability, we know, is something that is really been important for consumers in recent years. It continues to be so. When consumers find themselves in a tricky situation, it's something that they can afford to give, they can't afford to give as much focus to, but it doesn't mean that they're happy for brands to do the same. So maintaining standards, maintaining claims, and allowing consumers to trust that you're going to do that work for them on their behalf. So yeah, thinking about value in the round and making sure that you're not lost in the middle is going to be key in the next few months.
Yeah. Value definitely key. I mean, the concern, I think, is that what we're talking about is that the psychology of all this is very real for consumers, and that the more uncertainty persists, the more consumers will sort of shift to a more defensive position, and sort of almost the inevitable kind of will play out, and that we'll kind of almost walk into a recession. But what I will say is that's not the only scenario. And that, yes, tariffs could lead to a range of outcomes. And so when I think about this as lessons for brands, yes, you might have short-term turbulence, followed by recession, and a slowdown, as we're talking about really, here in terms of some of these behaviors, but you could still get turbulence followed by growth. You could get severe scenarios like stagflation. You could have a full-scale trade war escalation. And yet, on the other hand, we could get a rollback and sort of an easing of tensions, and the stock market picks up, as we're seeing today. So there are all these different scenarios. And so I think planning for a range of scenarios is key. Brands need to have plans in place for all scenarios. And of course, there are opportunities, and pockets of opportunity in terms of, however this is all going to play out. But, I think overall, in moments like these, clarity matters. Clarity is key. Brands that pay, close attention or stay close to their customers and consumers by listening and adapting, responding with empathy rather, will sort of not just sort of be able to navigate this turbulence. They'll emerge more trusted, and relevant and resilient than before.
I think a final point for me is that, again, to kind of follow on from what Andrew is saying about there's lots of different scenarios, there's also lots of different experiences of what may come. Not all consumers are the same, and we know that for every consumer that will have to opt out of a particular product line or category, whatever it may be, there'll be another household that's able to absorb, maybe unhappily, but absorb a price rise and keep spending. So knowing that customer, knowing the segmentation of your market, and understanding who it is that you're actually wanting to sell to, and therefore who it is that you actually need to talk to, is another really important issue.
Well, I think we could probably talk for another day or two. But I think we will close out our podcast here. There were a few things as you were talking that really stood out to me. Andrew, I'm really taken by your uncertainty is the word of the year. Absolutely. And I think we are in for a bit of a roller coaster ride, and hopefully it's not one with too many ups and downs and twists and turns. But most definitely, uncertainty is what is ahead of us. In thinking about consumers, Rich, I was really taken with actually something that you said when we were prepping for this, and you quoted one of my favorite movies, Jurassic Park, and that is consumers will find a way. So that, plus the fact that your comment just now about how consumers are all very different from one another, really does indicate that brands have a lot of directions that they can go, a lot of things that they can think about. But I think the most important thing then when it comes to brands is that whole clarity of communication. As both of you said, staying close to your customer, whoever that might be, and being clear and straightforward with your communication. So a lot to take from this initial podcast about tariffs, plenty more to come. Like I said in the beginning, this is not the end of the conversation. Our next tariff podcast is about how U.S. brands can navigate consumer sentiment outside the U.S. We touched on that a little bit, but I think there's plenty more to talk about. So for this podcast or any others, please subscribe to Little Conversation wherever you normally get your podcasts, or go to mintel.com. I think that's it for today. We'll see you real soon on the next Little Conversation.